The village of Darren lay tucked into the lap of the mountains, quiet, humble, and forgotten by the world beyond the winding trail that led to it. The homes were built of stone and wood, passed down through generations, and the people were hardened by weather and time. Life there was not measured by wealth or opportunity, but by survival, and those who lacked family or strength rarely found comfort. Among the villagers lived a woman named Layla, known simply as the widow. Her husband, Harris, had died 3 winters earlier in a logging accident when a thunderstorm loosened stones on the slopes and sent them crashing through the forest. He had been cutting timber to sell in the market down the valley, trying to save enough for their only child, a boy named Armin. The mountain took Harris swiftly, and Layla's world had collapsed that day. But she did not give up, not then. She worked in neighbors' fields, cleaned houses, gathered herbs from the hillside, and stitched old clothes to earn a few coins. Every scrap she saved went toward feeding Armin and keeping their home intact. The cottage was small, a single room, a low roof patched with clay, and a hearth that struggled to keep out the cold. Still, it was theirs, and it was where laughter once lived. Armin was quiet but bright. He had dark hair like his father and eyes full of questions. Though only 10 years old, he carried water from the well, helped his mother cut firewood, and dreamed of going down to the lowlands one day to become a teacher. He often sat by the window at night, tracing letters on a scrap of paper with charcoal. It was the only paper he had, and he guarded it as though it were a treasure. But the mountain did not care about dreams. It started with a fever. At first, Layla thought it was the cold winds of early spring or exhaustion from helping an elderly farmer plow his field. Armin said little about the pain in his head or the ache in his limbs. He didn't want his mother to worry. He knew the cost of hiring a healer was more than they possessed. Within 2 days, the fever deepened. Layla laid wet cloths across his forehead, brewed herb teas from plants she had gathered, and prayed in the quiet of the night. She spoke to him softly, wiping his face and whispering stories of his father's strength. Still, his breathing grew faint and uneven. The village healer, an older woman named Sapphira, came when Layla begged for help. But Sapphira's medicine was limited, and her knowledge imperfect. She mixed a paste of roots and leaves, murmured old mountain prayers, and placed her hands over Armin's chest. Layla waited, hope flickering like the flame of a dying candle. That night, the fever broke, but not in the way she wished. Armin's eyes fluttered open for a moment, and he looked at her with a strangely peaceful expression. He reached for her hand, his lips dry and trembling. She leaned close, her heart racing. "I'm sorry, Amma," he whispered, barely audible. And then the air left his chest in a breath so light it might have been mistaken for sleep. Layla did not scream. She did not fall to the floor or curse the heavens. Instead, she drew him into her arms and held him, rocking gently as though he were still the small child who once clung to her skirts. The silence inside that single-room cottage was immense, too vast to fit within the walls. Morning crept through the window, casting pale light over Armin's still face. Layla's eyes were red and swollen, but no tears remained. Grief had hollowed her out long before the sun rose. She dressed him in his cleanest clothing, the mended shirt he wore on festival days, and wrapped him in the wool blanket she had saved from her own wedding. She smoothed his hair and pressed her forehead against his. Her hands trembled, not from cold but from the weight of what came next. There was no one to help her bury him. No husband, no relatives, no friends who could spare the time or strength. The village graveyard lay on the other side of the ravine, and the ground was hard with frost. She had no shovel, no coffin, and no coin to pay for one. Yet she could not leave him in the cottage forever. The law of the mountain demanded burial, and the dignity of a mother demanded more. That morning, she made her decision. She would carry him to the only person she had not yet begged. The man in the mountain. The sky was still pale when Layla stepped outside with her child wrapped tightly against her chest. The morning air bit at her skin, but she did not shiver. The village was quiet, only thin trails of smoke rose from a few chimneys, and the roosters had just begun their calls. No one saw her leave, or perhaps they saw and pretended not to. Pity was a luxury they didn't bother with. She walked past the well, past the row of houses where children once played alongside Armin. The path curved around the fields, then narrowed into a stony track leading toward the higher slopes. Her feet were bare, but the pain of the cold ground did not register. The only weight she felt was the small, silent body she carried. The man she sought was known by many names among the villagers: the hermit, the ghost, the woodsman, and most commonly, the mountain man. Some said he had been a soldier long ago. Others whispered he was an outlaw who had fled justice. Children, when daring one another, claimed he could turn into a shadow or speak to wolves. Whatever the truth, no one went to his cabin unless driven by desperation. Layla had never imagined she would be one of them. But there was no grave for her son here. The land near the village was rocky and unforgiving. Hiring men to dig would cost more than she could dream of. The mountain man, they said, knew the earth and the forest better than any living soul. Some even claimed he had buried travelers who died on the trails, though whether out of duty or solitude, no one could say. The climb steepened after the first mile. The path forked near a stream, where melted snow trickled over stones as smooth as bones. Layla paused only long enough to adjust the blanket around Armin. Her arms ached from holding him, but she would not rest. Every time the wind blew, a part of her imagined he might wake, that warmth would return to his cheeks. Yet the stillness of his small form never changed. She passed through a thicket of fir and pine, their branches heavy with moisture. Birds called somewhere high above, but she did not lift her head to look. The air smelled of sap and wet bark. In the distance, she could see the peak, sharp, white-tipped, and ancient. That was where his cabin was said to be, near a clearing shaped by lightning and old storms. Memories flickered in her mind as she walked, Armin laughing as he chased goats near the hills, his small hands stained red from berries, the way he once pointed at the sky and asked if the stars were lanterns for souls. She had answered him softly then, telling him that maybe they were. The thought burned inside her now. Midway through the climb, she stumbled. A stone cut into her knee, and the skin split, but she caught herself before she fell on her son. Blood seeped down her shin, but she ignored it and rose again. Pain was irrelevant. Her breath came in short bursts, and her vision blurred from exhaustion, but her steps did not stop. Each one carried the same silent prayer: let someone help him rest. As the path narrowed to a ledge carved into the mountainside, memories of stories about the man returned to her, how he once broke a hunter's arm for setting traps near his land, how he refused food from villagers, how he spoke to no one for seasons at a time. He was said to be a man made of stone and shadows, with eyes that saw through lies and sorrow alike. By noon, the sun had climbed higher, but its warmth did not reach her. At last, through the trees, she saw it, the cabin. Built of dark timber and stone, it stood beside a fallen pine, its roof patched with moss and bark. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, thin and gray. She stopped a few paces away and looked at the door. Her heart pounded, not from fear of the man, but from the finality of her plea. She shifted her child gently in her arms, pressing her lips to his forehead one last time. Then, with a last fragment of strength she had, Layla approached the cabin and knocked. The knock echoed dully against the wooden door, swallowed by the quiet of the mountains. For a long moment, nothing stirred. Layla stood motionless, her breathing shallow, the small bundle in her arms growing heavier with every passing second. She wondered if he had heard her, or if he was even inside at all. Just as doubt began to set in, there was a subtle shift of sound from within. The creak of a floorboard. The muted thud of a boot against wood. Then silence again. The door opened. He stood in the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered, his face partially shadowed by the roof's overhang. His hair, once dark perhaps, was streaked with gray, tied loosely at the nape of his neck. His beard was untrimmed, but not wild. His clothing was plain, wool, leather, and fur stitched with threads that hinted at long years of self-reliance. His eyes, however, were the most striking feature. Not cruel, not welcoming, simply deep, like the mountain itself, unreadable and old. He did not speak. For a moment, he only looked at her, then at the shape she held pressed to her chest. Layla lowered her gaze, suddenly aware of her torn dress, bloodied knee, and wind-reddened hands. She could feel his scrutiny, but it held no mockery, no impatience. It was quiet and heavy, like snow on a branch. When she finally spoke, her voice came out raw and thin. "Please," she whispered, though the word caught in her throat. She shifted the bundle to reveal the child's still face, half veiled by the wool cloth. "Please. Bury my son." The man did not move, but something in his eyes flickered, almost imperceptibly, like a flame struggling behind glass. Layla braced herself for anger, rejection, or indifference. She had been prepared for a slammed door or a demand for payment she could never give. She had nothing left to offer but her plea. She continued, her words scarcely louder than breath. "I cannot bury him myself. The earth near the village is stone. I have no tools, no shroud, no place for him." Her voice trembled, but she did not cry. "They said you know the land. That you—" She hesitated, fearing the insult, "that you have buried others." The wind shifted, rustling the pines around the cabin. The man said nothing. He stepped back slightly, but not to close the door. He was listening. Layla lowered herself to her knees, the cold dirt biting into her skin. She laid the bundle carefully before her, her hands hovering an inch above it, as though still protecting her child from the world. "I am not asking for a coffin or a marker," she said softly. "Only the ground. Only a place where he can rest, and I can come to sit with him when I have strength." The man's brow furrowed faintly, whether in thought or memory, she could not tell. His gaze lingered on the child's pale cheek, then on the mother's trembling fingers. She bowed her head, bending forward until her forehead touched the earth. It was not an act of dignity, but surrender. If he refused her, she had no other path. No one else would help. Time stretched. Then, unexpectedly, he stepped outside. Layla heard the soft crunch of his boots on the ground near her, but she did not lift her head. She waited for his command to leave, or his warning, but none came. Instead, he crouched beside the bundle and carefully pulled back a corner of the blanket. His expression changed, not in shock or pity, but in recognition of something unspoken. There was no revulsion, no hesitation. He reached out, not to touch the child, but to steady the cloth around him. Layla, startled, looked up, searching his face. She felt her breath snag in her chest. The man finally spoke, but not to question her, or to send her away. "What is his name?" he asked, his voice low and worn, as though unused to speaking aloud. Layla's lips parted in disbelief. The question itself felt like an impossible kindness. "Armin," she whispered. "His name is Armin." The mountain man nodded once, slowly. And though he said nothing more yet, Layla sensed that something within him had shifted. For several long seconds, the man remained kneeling beside the small, wrapped body. The name, Armin, seemed to rest in the air between them, as real and solid as the earth beneath their feet. Layla watched him with cautious hope, afraid to speak again, afraid that one wrong word might shatter whatever silent decision he was making. Slowly, the man placed a firm hand on the ground and rose to his feet. He did not look at Layla right away. Instead, he looked out over the forested slope, his eyes fixed on some distant memory or thought she could not see. When he finally spoke, his voice held no anger, no impatience, only a heaviness that suggested it had carried far more grief than he ever intended to share. "Bring him inside," he said quietly. Layla blinked, unable to move at first. She had expected a question, an argument, or perhaps a refusal softened by pity, but not this. Not an invitation. She carefully gathered Armin back into her arms and rose on unsteady feet. The man stepped back from the door, giving her space to enter. Inside, the cabin was warmer than she expected. A small fire crackled in the stone hearth. The scent of pine resin and smoke lingered in the air. The furnishings were sparse but well crafted, a sturdy table, a single chair, a bed against the back wall, shelves lined with tools and jars of dried herbs. The man cleared a space on a long bench near the hearth and gestured for her to lay the child there. Layla hesitated, glancing at him for reassurance. He gave a silent nod. With trembling care, she placed Armin on the bench and smoothed the blanket around him once more. She stood back, unsure if she was meant to stay or leave. Her hands twisted in the fabric of her dress, and her throat felt as though it were closing. The man did not ask questions. He moved with quiet purpose, retrieving a folded cloth from a shelf and setting it beside the child. Layla could no longer remain silent. "I have nothing to give you," she said, barely audible. "No silver, no food, nothing of worth. I will work, if you ask it. I will gather wood, or clean, please, only give him a place." The man paused in his movement but did not turn to look at her. "I didn't ask for payment," he said simply. That alone would have been unbelievable, but what followed took the breath from Layla's lungs. "I'll build him a coffin," he continued, his tone steady as though he were commenting on the weather. "Not a shroud in the ground. Wood. Proper. He'll rest as he should." Layla stared at him, her lips parted in stunned silence. She had begged only for earth, nothing more. A burial without ceremony, without marker, would have been more than she ever thought she'd receive. Yet here was this man, this stranger, speaking of honor and care reserved only for the beloved or the noble. "You," she began, voice quivering. "You would do that?" The man did not answer immediately. His gaze rested briefly on her face, then moved to the child once more. When he finally responded, it was with a quiet intensity that suggested the words were pulled from an old wound. "I buried my wife and daughter," he said, his voice low. 10 winters passed. I carved their coffins by hand. No priest to speak. No village to help. Just the mountain and the snow." He stepped toward the door, lifting an axe from its place beside the frame. "I'll need pine," he muttered, almost to himself. "The earth is softer near the ridge. I know a place." Layla's breath caught. She pressed a hand to her mouth, the first tears since morning finally slipping free. No one in the village had ever spoken of this man's past, perhaps because no one had asked. Now, in the quiet of his cabin, his silence felt less like cruelty and more like survival. He stopped at the threshold and spoke without turning. "You can stay here until we finish," he said. "The wind will rise before night." And then he stepped outside, axe in hand, as though the task were already his to bear. Layla sank to her knees beside the bench, her trembling hand resting gently on Armin's brow. For the first time since his final breath, the crushing weight on her chest loosened, if only slightly. The sun had already dipped behind the ridge when the mountain man returned with cut pine balanced across his shoulders. His breath fogged in the cooling air, but his movements remained steady, deliberate. Layla had not left her son's side in his absence. She had not eaten, nor slept, though the warmth of the cabin and the soft crackle of the fire had threatened to pull her under more than once. When the door creaked open, she rose to her feet, unsure if she should offer help or step aside. He did not ask anything of her, only set down the wood and began working as though he had built 100 coffins before. He cleared the table, laid the pine across it, and drew a knife and plane from the wall. The sound of the blade shaving wood was rhythmic, almost gentle. Each stroke seemed to shape more than timber, it carved silence into something sacred. Layla watched from the bench, hands clasped in her lap. The man did not look at her, but neither did he seem to mind her presence. Hours passed. The fire dimmed. The scent of fresh-cut pine filled the cabin, mixing with smoke and winter air. When the coffin took form, small, humble, but solid, the man paused only once, wiping his brow with the back of his sleeve. Layla approached slowly, her fingers brushing the smooth edge of the wooden lid. "It's more than I ever." Her voice trembled before she could finish. He didn't let her. "It's what he should have," he said, as if stating an undeniable truth. When the coffin was complete, he lined it with clean cloth from his trunk, a cloth so well preserved she wondered if it had once belonged to someone he loved. He lifted Armin as though carrying something breakable and placed him gently inside. Layla smoothed the boy's hair one final time, then rested both hands on the tiny chest that no longer rose and fell. "May I sit with him a moment?" she asked quietly. He gave a single nod and stepped outside, leaving her alone with the child and the fire's soft glow. Layla whispered prayers, some learned from her mother, others born purely of desperation. She spoke of memories, of lullabies, of the way Armin once smiled with only half his mouth. When her tears finally dried, she laid the blanket over him and closed the lid herself. The man re-entered without a word. He picked up the coffin as though it weighed no more than a sack of grain in motion for her to follow. Night had fallen fully, but the moonlight washed the forest in silver. The air was cold, sharp, but not cruel. They walked through a narrow path she had not noticed before, winding between tall pines and moss-covered stones. He carried the coffin in silence, his steps measured, sure. Layla followed, her hands pressed against her chest, as though holding in breath and heart both. After some time, the trees opened into a small clearing nestled against a rise in the land. The earth here was softer, dark and rich beneath a thin layer of frost. She could see, just barely, two old wooden markers near the far end, worn down by years of weather. Without explaining, he set down the coffin and began to dig. The shovel bit into the ground with dull, steady thuds. Layla dropped to her knees beside him and began clearing loose soil with her hands. He did not stop her. When the grave was ready, he lowered the coffin into the earth with surprising care. Layla knelt at the edge, pressing her palms to the lid as though she could still feel warmth within. "Thank you," she whispered, not because it was enough, but because it was all she had left. He stood beside her, staring at the ground, his jaw tight. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, quietly, he spoke. "You don't have to leave tonight. There's room in the cabin." Layla looked up sharply, not from fear but disbelief. He wasn't offering charity. His voice carried something else, recognition, perhaps, or remembrance. "I can work," she said after a moment. "I can cook, mend, gather water." "Stay," he interrupted gently. "Work can wait." She nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. Together, they covered the grave. When the last of the soil was patted flat, the man placed a stone at its head, leaving space beside it for something more permanent. He did not call it a marker. He did not have to. As they walked back through the trees, the silence between them no longer felt heavy. It felt shared. At the cabin door, Layla turned once more toward the clearing, where the earth now held the boy she had carried alone. She closed her eyes, and for the first time since dawn, exhaled without breaking. Inside, the fire still burned. And though neither spoke of it, not that night, nor the one after, the mountain had already begun to knit two broken lives into something quietly whole.